This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the high desert country of southeastern Oregon, where the sagebrush stretches for miles and the wind carries sounds from distances that seem impossible, there exists a section of land that appears on no current maps. The area, approximately 47 square miles, is marked only by its absence. A blank space on topographical surveys, a void in satellite imagery that official sources attribute to technical glitches or deliberate redaction for national security purposes. Local residents, those few who remain in the surrounding townships, refer to it simply as the Ash Creek Zone, though there is no longer any creek there, ash-covered or otherwise. The first documented mention of something unusual in that region appears in a livestock census from 1953, filed by a rancher named Hollis Pruitt. His report, discovered in 1967 during an audit of agricultural records by a graduate student named Vera Lindstrom at Oregon State University, contained an odd notation in the margins. Pruitt had written that 73 head of cattle had been lost that year, not to disease or predators, but to what he described as the wrong kind of quiet. When questioned by census takers about this cryptic phrase, Pruitt apparently refused to elaborate, stating only that certain portions of his grazing land were no longer suitable for livestock and would remain fenced off indefinitely. What makes this notation particularly significant is that Pruitt was known throughout Harney County as a practical man, not given to superstition or exaggeration. His grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1887, and the Pruitt family had maintained one of the largest cattle operations in the region for 3 generations. For such a man to abandon nearly a quarter of his grazing land without clear explanation suggested something more than ordinary caution. The area in question lies roughly 38 miles northwest of the small town of Fields, Oregon, population 72 as of the 1960 census. The landscape is harsh and beautiful in equal measure, high desert punctuated by volcanic rock formations with elevations ranging from 4,000 to just over 6,000 feet. Winters are brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping below zero, and summers are scorching, with little rainfall and temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. It is not land that forgives mistakes or carelessness. In the spring of 1958, a geological survey team from the U.S. Department of the Interior arrived in Harney County to assess mineral deposits in the region. The team consisted of 4 individuals: lead geologist Dr. Merritt Ashford, field technician Desmond Cale, surveyor Cormac Hayes, and documentation specialist Sybil Oakes. Their assignment was routine: catalog rock formations, take soil samples, and assess the commercial viability of potential mining operations. According to records maintained at the Bureau of Land Management office in Burns, Oregon, the team checked in on April 3, 1958, and was expected to complete their survey within 6 weeks. On May 22, 23 days after their scheduled return date, only 2 members of the team emerged from the survey area. Desmond Cale and Sybil Oakes walked into the sheriff's office in Burns just after dawn, carrying minimal equipment and showing signs of severe dehydration and exposure. The official report, filed by Sheriff Clayton Morse on May 23, 1958, is striking in its brevity. It states that Cale and Oakes reported the deaths of Drs. Ashford and Cormac Hayes due to complications arising from environmental exposure. The bodies, according to the survivors, had been left at the survey site due to the impossibility of transporting them over difficult terrain. When pressed for the exact location, Cale and Oakes provided coordinates that placed the site within what would later be designated as the Ash Creek Zone. What the official report does not include, and what only came to light in 1966, when a reporter for the Burns Times-Herald named Ronan Vickers interviewed a retired deputy who had been present during the initial questioning, is that both survivors refused to speak about what had actually occurred during those 49 days. According to the deputy, whose name appears in Vickers' notes as J.L. Brenner, they weren't acting like people who had just lost colleagues to exposure. They were acting like people who had witnessed something they couldn't reconcile with their understanding of the world. Brenner's notes, which Vickers reproduced in his article, describe Oakes as catatonic for the first several hours, unresponsive to questions, staring at the wall with an expression that suggested she was still seeing something we couldn't. Cale was more communicative, but his answers were described as evasive and internally contradictory. When asked how his colleagues had died, Cale reportedly said they went where they shouldn't have gone, but would not or could not elaborate on what that meant. A recovery team was dispatched to retrieve the bodies using the coordinates provided by the survivors. The team consisted of 8 men, 6 deputies, a medic, and a local guide named Foster Quinn, who knew the high desert better than anyone alive. They departed on May 24th with enough supplies for a week-long expedition. According to their trip log, preserved in the county archives, they reached the general area indicated by the coordinates on the evening of May 27th. The log entries for May 28th are sparse. The team reported finding what appeared to be a survey camp, but no bodies. Equipment was scattered across the site, some of it damaged in ways that suggested deliberate destruction rather than environmental exposure. One notation reads, "Surveying instruments appear to have been smashed with considerable force. Samples containers broken open, contents dispersed." Another entry, written in different handwriting, states simply, "Something is wrong with the sound here." That cryptic phrase, "something is wrong with the sound," appears multiple times in the log entries from that day, written by different team members. One entry attempts to explain, "Sound carries differently in this location. Voices seem to come from incorrect directions. Echo patterns don't match the terrain." The medic, whose signature is illegible, but whose entries are consistently the most detailed, wrote, "3 of the deputies are experiencing vertigo and disorientation. Foster Quinn insists we leave immediately. He says this land doesn't want us here. I'm inclined to agree, though I can't articulate exactly why." The team departed the site on the evening of May 28th without locating the bodies. Their return to Burns on May 30th was noted in the sheriff's log, but no official explanation was given for their failure to complete the recovery mission. The case was formally closed on June 2, 1958, with the deaths of Dr. Merritt Ashford and Cormac Hayes listed as presumed fatal due to environmental exposure, bodies unrecovered. Foster Quinn, the guide who had insisted the team leave the site, died 3 months later. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Lawrence Whitcomb in Burns, lists the cause as cardiac arrest, which was unremarkable given that Quinn was 64 years old and had spent decades working in physically demanding conditions. What is remarkable is a notation in Dr. Whitcomb's personal records, which his daughter donated to the Oregon Historical Society in 1969. In an entry dated August 14, 1958, 2 days before Quinn's death, Whitcomb wrote, "Foster came to the clinic today. He wanted something to help him sleep, said he hadn't rested properly since the recovery mission in May. When I asked about nightmares, he said it wasn't dreams keeping him awake, but the absence of them. He said when he closed his eyes, all he heard was that wrong silence. I prescribed a mild sedative, but I don't think it's a medical problem." The next entry in Whitcomb's records, dated August 17th, reads, "Foster Quinn found deceased in his home this morning, apparent heart attack. His landlady said she heard him walking the floors all night for the past several weeks, back and forth, as if pacing. When she checked on him this morning, he was sitting upright in his chair by the window, eyes open, facing in the direction of the survey site, some 38 miles distant. House was locked from inside. No signs of disturbance. But the strangest detail, every clock in his residence had stopped at the same time, 3:17 in the morning." Over the following months, the survey site and the surrounding area gradually acquired a reputation among locals. Ranch hands who worked land adjacent to the zone reported similar phenomena: unusual acoustic properties, a sense of persistent unease, livestock that refused to graze in certain areas. Hollis Pruitt's original complaint about the wrong kind of quiet began to make more sense to neighboring ranchers, who noted that even birds seemed to avoid the airspace above certain sections of land. In early 1959, the Department of Defense issued a notice declaring approximately 47 square miles of land in southeastern Harney County to be a restricted military zone closed to civilian access. No explanation was provided, and no military installations were subsequently built in the area. The only visible change was the erection of chain-link fencing around the perimeter, marked with standard "No Trespassing," U.S. government property signs. No guards were posted, no patrols were established. The area was simply cordoned off and left undisturbed. This action raised questions among local residents, particularly given that there had been no previous military activity in that specific location. Several ranchers, including Hollis Pruitt, filed complaints with the Bureau of Land Management, arguing that the restriction impacted grazing rights and property values. These complaints were acknowledged but never addressed. Pruitt's correspondence file, discovered by researcher Vera Lindstrom during her 1967 investigation, contained 17 letters to various government agencies, all requesting clarification on the reason for the restricted zone. Only 3 responses were received, each stating simply that the restriction was necessary for national security purposes and that no further information could be provided. Hollis Pruitt died in 1961. According to his obituary in the Burns Times-Herald, he had been in declining health for several years. His daughter, Iris Pruitt Damon, inherited the ranch and immediately sold it to a developer from Boise. In an interview conducted by Ronan Vickers in 1966, Damon explained her decision. "My father spent his last years obsessed with that restricted zone. He kept detailed records of everything he observed from his land that bordered it. Strange lights at night, though not like aircraft or vehicles. Sounds that didn't correspond to any natural source. He would sit on the porch after dark with binoculars, watching the fence line. In his final year, he barely ran the ranch at all. He was consumed by the need to understand what was happening there. When he died, I found notebooks in his study, dozens of them, filled with observations, theories, diagrams. I burned them all. I didn't want to carry whatever obsession had gripped him." When Vickers asked what had made her father so obsessed, Damon's response was telling. He felt responsible. He believed that something had been set in motion on his land, and that by not preventing it or not understanding it, he had failed some fundamental duty. He never explained what he meant by that, but in his final weeks, he kept saying he should have stopped them from digging. I don't know who them was or what they had been digging for. This mention of digging connects to another fragmentary piece of evidence discovered during Vera Lindstrom's research. In the archived records of a Boise-based drilling company called Westmount Geological Services, she found an invoice dated October 1957, 6 months before the ill-fated survey team's expedition. The invoice was addressed to the Department of the Interior and listed charges for exploratory drilling services at coordinates that fell within the present Ash Creek zone. The drilling depth was listed as 470 feet, and the invoice included a note. 3 bore sites completed as specified. All samples delivered to client. Standard confidentiality agreement in effect. The attempts by Lindstrom to locate these samples or any reports associated with the drilling operation proved unsuccessful. Westmount Geological Services had ceased operations in 1962, and its records had been acquired by a larger firm, which subsequently was absorbed by an even larger corporation. By the time Lindstrom traced the chain of ownership, the relevant documents had been either lost or destroyed during multiple office relocations. The only surviving evidence that the drilling had occurred at all was that single invoice, preserved by accident as a box of miscellaneous financial records that had never been properly cataloged. The year 1963 marked another significant event in the history of the Ash Creek Zone. On the night of June 11th, residents of Fields, Oregon, reported seeing unusual lights in the sky to the northwest, the direction of the restricted area. Multiple witnesses described the lights as pulsing and greenish-white, unlike any aircraft or weather phenomenon they had witnessed before. The lights were visible for approximately 40 minutes, from 10:30 p.m. to 11:10 p.m., and then vanished abruptly. The following morning, several residents who had witnessed the lights reported experiencing severe headaches, nausea, and disorientation. Dr. Nathan Cordell, the physician who maintained a clinic in Fields 3 days per week, examined 7 individuals and noted in his records that their symptoms were consistent with acute vestibular disturbance, though he could identify no clear cause. All 7 individuals recovered within 48 hours, but several reported persistent low-level tinnitus, a ringing in the ears that continued for weeks afterward. Dr. Cordell's notes on this incident are preserved in the Oregon Medical Association archives. In an addendum dated June 14, 1963, he wrote, "I have practiced medicine in rural areas for 23 years and have never encountered a case quite like this." The patients described the sensation not as traditional vertigo, but as a feeling that space itself was wrong. One woman, Adele Kirkland, said she felt as though she could sense the curvature of the earth beneath her feet and that it was moving in ways it shouldn't. When I suggested this might be simple disorientation, she became agitated and insisted I wasn't understanding her. She said it was like suddenly being able to perceive something that is always present but normally imperceptible, and that once perceived, it couldn't be ignored. No official investigation into the lights was conducted, at least none that entered public record. However, 2 days after the incident, 3 vehicles bearing government plates arrived in Fields and remained for approximately 6 hours. Witnesses reported seeing men in civilian attire conducting interviews with those who had seen the lights. These men identified themselves as being from the Department of Defense, but provided no further details about the purpose of their visit. They departed in the early afternoon of June 13th and were never seen in the area again. One of the individuals interviewed during this visit was Desmond Cale, the field technician who had survived the 1958 survey expedition. Cale had moved to Fields in 1961, ostensibly to retire after a career in geological fieldwork, though he was only 47 years old at the time. He lived alone in a small house on the eastern edge of town and rarely interacted with neighbors. According to residents interviewed by Ronan Vickers in 1966, Cale spent most of his time reading and maintaining extensive correspondence with unknown recipients, thick letters that he mailed regularly, but which never seemed to generate responses. What happened during Cale's interview with the government representatives is unknown, as he refused to discuss it with anyone. However, 3 weeks later, on July 4, 1963, Cale was found dead in his home. The county coroner ruled the death a self-inflicted incident, noting that Cale had apparently consumed a lethal quantity of barbiturates along with alcohol. There was no note. The discovery was made by the postmaster, Virgil Stanton, who had noticed Cale's mailbox overflowing and became concerned. Stanton's account, given to the sheriff's deputy who responded to the scene, includes a detail that didn't make it into the official report, but which Stanton later shared with Ronan Vickers. "When I entered the house, I noticed immediately that every drawer and cabinet was open, as if Desmond had been searching for something. Papers were scattered everywhere, but the thing that struck me most was what I found on his kitchen table, a map of the area, with the restricted zone circled in red ink. Written across the map in large letters were the words, 'It continues to grow.'" No explanation was ever provided for what Cale meant by this phrase. The map was noted in the inventory of his possessions, but was not preserved as evidence, as no crime had been committed. By the time Vickers attempted to locate it in 1966, it had been disposed of during routine clearing of archived materials. Sybil Oakes, the other survivor of the 1958 expedition, had moved to California shortly after the incident. Attempts by various researchers over the years to locate and interview her proved unsuccessful. She appeared in no telephone directories, held no professional licenses, and seemed to have vanished entirely from public records. In 1968, Vera Lindstrom received an anonymous letter postmarked from San Francisco. The letter, written in neat cursive on plain stationery, contained only 4 sentences. "I know you have been researching the survey team incident. I was there. Some doors should remain closed. Stop looking." The letter was unsigned, but handwriting analysis commissioned by Lindstrom suggested with reasonable confidence that it had been written by a woman in her 30s or 40s, consistent with Oakes's age at that time. Throughout the 1960s, the Ash Creek Zone remained cordoned off and largely forgotten by all but a small number of individuals who maintained an interest in the case. The most dedicated of these was a retired civil engineer named Garrett Wolfe, who had worked on various government projects throughout the western United States during the 1940s and 50s. Wolfe became interested in the Ash Creek Zone after reading a brief mention of it in a geology journal in 1964. He began collecting information, conducting interviews, and attempting to piece together a comprehensive understanding of what had occurred there. Wolfe's research methods were meticulous. He obtained copies of every available document related to the area, interviewed dozens of witnesses and their family members, and even managed to acquire aerial photographs of the zone taken before and after its restriction. These photographs, though of limited quality given the technology of the era, showed a landscape that appeared unremarkable: sagebrush desert, rock formations, no obvious structures or developments. The only notable feature was what appeared to be a dry creek bed, which presumably gave the area its informal name. In 1966, Wolfe compiled his findings into an extensive manuscript titled The Ash Creek Enigma, an investigation into unexplained phenomena in Harney County, Oregon. He submitted the manuscript to several university presses and scientific journals, but all declined to publish it. The rejection letters, which Wolfe preserved, cited various reasons: lack of verifiable evidence, reliance on anecdotal testimony, speculative conclusions. One editor wrote, "While your research is thorough, the subject matter falls outside the scope of serious scientific inquiry." Undeterred, Wolfe self-published a limited run of 200 copies in early 1967. The book received almost no attention. A brief review in a regional newspaper described it as an interesting, if ultimately unconvincing, attempt to manufacture mystery where none exists. Most of the copies remained unsold, and by the time of Wolfe's death in 1973, fewer than 50 had been distributed. However, one copy reached Vera Lindstrom, who was concluding her own research into the Ash Creek Zone as part of her graduate studies. Lindstrom found Wolfe's work compelling and decided to visit him at his home in Bend, Oregon, in March 1967. According to her notes from that meeting, Wolfe was in poor health. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of neurological disorder several months prior, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Despite his failing health, his mind remained sharp, and he spent several hours discussing his research with Lindstrom. Lindstrom's notes from that conversation are among the most detailed first-hand accounts of Wolfe's theories. He believed that something had been discovered during the 1957 drilling operation, something that the Department of the Interior had not expected to find and did not know how to handle. The subsequent survey team, he theorized, had been sent to investigate further, but had encountered something they were unprepared for. The restriction of the zone, he suggested, was not to protect a military installation or classified research, but to contain something that could not be adequately explained or controlled. When Lindstrom asked what he thought had been found, Wolf's response was measured but unsettling. "I don't think they found an object or a substance. I think they found a condition. Something about that specific location, whether it's geological, spatial, or something else entirely, creates effects that contradict our understanding of how physical space behaves. The drilling didn't discover it so much as activate it, or perhaps expose it. And once exposed, it began to expand." This theory aligned with Desmond Cale's final written message. It continues to grow. Denimare. Wolf believed that whatever phenomenon existed in the Ash Creek zone was not static, but was gradually expanding its influence outward from some central point. He pointed to the gradual increase in the reported affected area, from the original survey site to the larger restricted zone, as evidence of this expansion. Lindstrom pressed him for more concrete evidence, and Wolf produced what he considered his most significant find, a copy of a memo dated September 1957, apparently leaked from Department of Interior files. The memo, addressed to an unnamed recipient and signed only with the initials R.T. Schnee, discussed the preliminary results of the drilling operation. The relevant passage read, "Analysis of core samples from bore site 2 reveals anomalies that defy conventional explanation. Material composition normal to depth of approximately 320 feet, at which point instruments began registering inconsistent readings. Below 380 feet, samples cannot be properly analyzed. Physical properties appear to fluctuate, depending on observation method and timing. Recommend immediate consultation with specialists in redacted before proceeding with further operations." The authenticity of this memo has never been verified. Attempts by Lindstrom and others to locate the original in government archives proved unsuccessful. Wolf claimed he had received it from a former Department of Interior employee who wished to remain anonymous, but he never provided any means of confirming this source. Skeptics have suggested the memo was fabricated, either by Wolf himself or by someone seeking to mislead him. Without corroboration, it remains an intriguing but ultimately questionable piece of evidence. Garrett Wolf died on August 3, 1973. In accordance with his wishes, his research materials were donated to the Oregon Historical Society. However, when the society attempted to catalog the collection in 1974, they discovered that significant portions were missing. Entire boxes of documents, photographs, and interview transcripts had vanished between Wolf's death and the transfer of materials. His executor, a lawyer named Morton Hale, insisted that he had delivered everything from Wolf's study to the Historical Society. But the Society's records showed that only about 60% of the expected materials had been received. The missing items were never recovered, and no explanation for their disappearance was ever established. One document that did survive in Wolf's collection was a personal journal he kept during the final months of his life. The entries grow increasingly difficult to read as his neurological condition worsened, but certain passages are chilling in their clarity. On June 7, 1973, less than 2 months before his death, he wrote, "I dreamed last night of the zone. In the dream, I was standing at the fence line looking in. The landscape was empty, but I had the overwhelming sense that the emptiness itself was aware of me. Not that something in the landscape was watching, but that the absence, the void, had become conscious. I woke with the certainty that my research has not gone unnoticed. I feel observed in a way I cannot articulate. It is not paranoia. It is knowledge." The Ash Creek zone remained largely undisturbed throughout the 1970s and 80s. The fence line was maintained, presumably by some government agency, but no one ever saw maintenance crews working on it. The signs warning of government property remained, though they weathered and faded with time. Local residents gradually ceased talking about the area. New generations moved to the region with no knowledge of the history, and those who remembered generally chose not to speak of it. In 1982, a fire swept through the high desert country of Harney County, consuming over 100,000 acres of rangeland. The fire came within 3 miles of the Ash Creek Zone's northern boundary, but did not cross into the restricted area. Fire crews noted this in their reports, attributing it to favorable wind conditions and the natural firebreak provided by a rocky ridge. However, one crew chief, interviewed years later by a documentary filmmaker, expressed doubt about this explanation. "We had fires jumping half-mile gaps that summer, carried by winds that could pick up embers and drop them miles away. For that fire to stop so precisely at the zone boundary didn't fit the conditions we were seeing. It was like the fire just decided not to go there." The 1990s saw renewed interest in the Ash Creek Zone from a different quarter. With the rise of internet forums and conspiracy theory communities, the restricted area became a topic of speculation among those interested in government secrets and unexplained phenomena. Most of these discussions were wildly inaccurate, involving claims of underground bases, extraterrestrial contact, and other elements unsupported by any credible evidence. The actual documented history of the area became buried beneath layers of fabrication and exaggeration. One forum member, using the screen name High Desert Watcher, claimed in 1998 to have grown up in fields and to remember the events of 1963. This individual provided details that aligned with documented accounts, but also added new information that could not be verified. They claimed their grandfather had been part of the recovery team that searched for the bodies of the survey team members in 1958, and that the grandfather had kept a personal diary of the expedition that contradicted the official trip log. According to High Desert Watcher, this diary described the team finding not just a disturbed campsite, but something more troubling. Evidence that the survey team had been engaged in excavation work beyond their stated mission parameters. The diary allegedly described a partially exposed opening in the ground, roughly circular, approximately 8 feet in diameter, descending beyond the reach of the recovery team's flashlights. The ground around this opening was described as having an oily texture and emitting a smell like burnt copper and something organic that had been preserved too long. These claims cannot be verified. High Desert Watcher never provided scans or photographs of the alleged diary, and attempts to identify them or contact them offline were unsuccessful. The account was deleted from the forum in 2001, and the user never reappeared. However, the description of an excavated opening aligns intriguingly with Iris Pruitt-Damon's recollection of her father's obsession with stopping them from digging. In 2003, satellite imagery of the United States became widely available through civilian mapping services. Users quickly noticed that the area corresponding to the Ash Creek Zone appeared pixelated or obscured in these images. Service providers responded to inquiries by stating that certain areas were redacted at the request of government agencies for national security purposes, which was standard practice for active military installations. However, as had been true for decades, there was no visible military activity in the Ash Creek Zone, no buildings, no roads, no infrastructure of any kind. It was simply empty land that no one was allowed to enter. A graduate student at the University of Oregon named Malcolm Frost wrote his master's thesis in 2006 on government land restrictions in the western United States. In his research, he attempted to visit the Ash Creek Zone to document its current state. On September 12, 2006, he drove to the area with a camera and recording equipment. According to his thesis, he approached the fence line from the south. At a point roughly 12 miles west of Fields, Frost's description of the area is matter-of-fact. The landscape appears typical of high desert terrain, sagebrush, scattered juniper, volcanic rock formations. The fence is standard chain link, 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire. No guards were present. No surveillance equipment was visible, though I cannot discount the possibility of hidden cameras or sensors. The warning signs were faded but legible. I walked along the perimeter for approximately 2 miles, observing conditions inside the restricted area. Nothing appeared unusual or notable. It was simply empty land. However, Frost also noted something that he found difficult to explain. At one point, while walking parallel to the fence, I noticed that my watch had stopped. The battery was new, replaced less than a month prior. I noted the time on my phone for 4:47 p.m. and continued walking. After approximately 20 minutes, I checked my phone again to gauge how much ground I'd covered. It showed 1:51 p.m., suggesting only 4 minutes had passed. I assumed this was an error or that I'd misread the time initially. However, when I returned to my vehicle and checked the dashboard clock, it showed 2:09 p.m., which aligned with my phone. My watch, when I examined it later, had stopped at exactly 1:47 p.m., the moment I had first noticed the issue. I replaced the battery twice afterward, but the watch never functioned correctly again. It would run for varying periods, sometimes hours, sometimes only minutes, and then stop, always showing a different time. Frost included this anecdote in an appendix to his thesis, noting that he could offer no explanation for it and that it might be entirely coincidental. His thesis was accepted, and he moved on to other research interests. But the watch incident echoes earlier reports, Foster Quinn's clocks stopping at 3:17 a.m., the survey team's instruments malfunctioning, the persistent theme of temporal anomalies associated with the area. The most recent documented event related to the Ash Creek Zone occurred in 2009, though it only became publicly known in 2011. A researcher at Los Alamos National Laboratory named Dr. Helena Voss published a paper in an obscure geophysics journal examining what she termed spatial anomalies in various locations around the United States. The paper was highly technical, dealing with measurements of gravitational fields, magnetic variations, and other physical properties that fell outside standard parameters. One of the locations she discussed, identified in the paper only by coordinates, corresponded to the Ash Creek Zone. Dr. Voss reported that long-range sensors had detected persistent irregularities in spatial metrics at this location, with readings that suggested local distortions in the fabric of space-time on a scale inconsistent with known geological or man-made sources. She noted that these readings had been consistent over a monitoring period of 3 years and appeared to be slowly intensifying. The paper received almost no attention in the scientific community. Most readers assumed the readings were the result of instrument error or misinterpretation of data. Dr. Voss published no follow-up research and retired from Los Alamos in 2010. Attempts to contact her for clarification on her findings have been unsuccessful. And so the Ash Creek Zone remains a blank space on maps, a restricted area with no visible purpose, a source of questions that have no official answers. The fence line is still maintained, the signs still warn away visitors, and the land within lies silent and undisturbed. Those who remember the history are mostly gone now. Fields, Oregon, has a population of 43 as of the most recent census. Most of its current residents have never heard of the survey team or the lights or the theories about what might lie beneath that high desert soil. There are no ghosts in this story, no supernatural elements to explain what happened, just a series of documented events that resist easy interpretation. A survey team that vanished in 1958, 2 survivors who refused to speak of what they'd witnessed, bodies that were never found. A drilling operation 6 months earlier that discovered something in the deep earth that couldn't be properly analyzed. A guide who died hearing wrong silence, a field technician who took his own life after being interviewed by government representatives, a researcher who claimed it continues to grow. The physical evidence is sparse. A few invoices, some medical records, interview transcripts, personal journals. The witness testimony is fragmented and often contradictory. The official explanations are absent or inadequate. What remains is a pattern, a series of events connected by geography, and a shared quality of wrongness that defies articulation. Perhaps there is a mundane explanation for all of it. Perhaps the survey team died of exposure exactly as stated, and everything else is coincidence, exaggeration, or misinterpretation of ordinary phenomena. Perhaps the government restricted the land for classified military research that has since been declassified or relocated. Perhaps the acoustic anomalies and time distortions are the result of unique geological conditions that create unusual environmental effects. Perhaps the obsessions and mental deterioration of various individuals involved in the case reflect nothing more than the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. But the land remains closed. No explanation has ever been offered. The satellites still blur that section of Oregon desert. And sometimes, on clear nights, residents of fields report seeing lights on the northwestern horizon, faint, pulsing, greenish-white, in the direction of a place that exists on no map and which no one is permitted to visit. What was found there in 1957, 470 feet below the high desert floor? What did the survey team encounter in 1958 that left two survivors unable or unwilling to speak? What continues to grow in that empty space behind the fence, in that blank area on the map? These questions have no answers, or if they do, those answers are locked away in classified files that may never be opened. The Ash Creek Zone exists in the space between what can be documented and what can be explained. It is a reminder that even in our mapped and surveyed world, there are still places that resist understanding, not because they contain anything supernatural, but because they expose the limits of our framework for making sense of reality. They show us that there are conditions, phenomena, or perhaps simply configurations of space and geology that fall outside our categories of explanation, and so the story remains incomplete, as perhaps it must. The fence line endures, the land stays silent, and the questions persist. Questions about what lies beneath the sagebrush and volcanic rock, what disturbance might have been initiated by drilling into the deep earth, what properties of that specific location might create effects that seem to violate the rules by which we understand the world. The files are incomplete, the witnesses are mostly gone, and the land itself offers no testimony. All that remains is the absence, the blank space on the map, the restricted zone with no stated purpose, the place you can never visit. And in that absence, in that silence, something persists. Not a presence, but perhaps its opposite, a kind of emptiness that has somehow become active, a void that has learned to influence the space around it. Or perhaps that too is just another theory, another attempt to impose meaning on events that have no deeper significance than coincidence and circumstance. Perhaps the true horror is not that there is something terrible hidden in the Ash Creek Zone, but that there might be nothing at all, just empty land, restricted for forgotten reasons, invested with significance only by our need to believe that mysteries must have solutions. But if that were true, why maintain the fence? Why redact the satellite imagery? Why has no official explanation ever been provided, no declassification ever occurred, no records been released? Why does that 47 square miles of Oregon desert remain off-limits more than 60 years after the restriction was first imposed? These are questions without answers. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Ash Creek Zone is meant to remain a question, a gap in knowledge, a reminder that not everything can be explained or understood or filed away as solved. The desert wind still blows across that land, moving the sagebrush, whistling through the fence line, carrying sounds from distances that seem wrong. The volcanic rock formations cast shadows that lengthen as the sun sets, and somewhere in that restricted space, 470 feet below the surface, perhaps deeper, there might exist something that was uncovered in 1957 and never properly covered again, or there might exist nothing at all. But you cannot go there to find out. The fence forbids it. The signs warn you away. And perhaps that is for the best. Some places are restricted not because they contain secrets worth protecting, but because they contain questions that are dangerous to ask.